everybody, before we get started, are you headed to the Wild Goose Festival? Thousands of campers are headed to the beautiful hills of North Carolina June 21st through 24th. Wild Goose is a festival at the intersection of justice, spirituality, and art. Some of this year's guests are Jim Wallace, Brian McLaren, and Shane Claiborne. ChurchNext is a proud sponsor. Find out more at www.wildgoosefestival.org. Here's your program. Hi everybody, I'm Chris Yaw. Welcome to ChurchNext. This is a place where people who are passionate about the local church come to hear from experienced mentors. And today we're joined by a leader in the evangelical church world. He's a megachurch pastor who helps guide the flock of Hill Country Bible Church, which is in the Austin, Texas area. And I'm talking with Tim Hawks. He's the senior pastor of Hill Country that every weekend draws more than 5,000 people to its church. Tim's got a deep passion for church planting. Planted a church in Louisiana before coming to Hill Country. And Tim, why don't we start right there? Why don't you begin by giving me the stats? Tell us a little bit about Hill Country. How did it begin, and how has it grown today?
Well, thanks, Chris. It's great to be with you. Hill Country's been really an amazing story. It was originally planted, it's 25 years old, and it was originally planted by a group of lay people who, as the community was growing northwest in Austin, there weren't many churches here, and so they wanted to plant a church, and so they organized 17 individuals. They organized it. They went out and hired a pastor, brought the pastor in, and basically started meeting in an elementary school. 3 years into it, or about 2.5 years into it, the pastor had a moral failure. And so he left, and the church had grown to about 250 people, was doing really well. The guy was a phenomenal teacher of the Bible, strong relational guy, great DNA, but the moral problem took him under. Yeah. And so I had planted a church in Louisiana, and I was looking to plant again. And this was kind of a 2.5-year-old church that needed a pastor, and so through a process, God brought us together. So that's how I ended up here 23 years ago.
You know, and I'm going to stop you right there, Tim, because I think one of the things that you and I, who have been pastors for a little while, run into, unfortunately, not too frequently, is when there is some sort of moral lapse in a congregation, and it leads to the coming of another. And every denomination has it. This is nothing picking on nobody other than our own human peccadillos. And so I wondered if you could talk with us a little bit about what it was like to come into a congregation of 250 people. What are the issues that you had to deal with? I assume it's not. I'm sure it's not the same as going into a healthy congregation that had 250 people. You just kind of walk in and go. What was it like when you first got there, and how did you go about to rebuild trust?
That's a great question. I probably can't take a ton of credit for any of it personally. In the 9 months that the church was without a pastor, they actually held pretty strongly to the congregation. It was 180 when I got here, which is a pretty significant decline. But in that venue, when you have that kind of moral failure and trust broken, you almost expect the church to fall apart, and it didn't. But what had happened was the elders of the church, they called the congregation together, and they were really willing to disclose everything they knew. So they took away all the gossip, all of the kinds of things that would create within people a sense of distrust, and they laid it all out before the congregation. And then in one really incredible move of the Spirit, they basically apologized to the congregation for having prayed with a man on a weekly basis who was involved in this and didn't know enough about him and what was going on in his life to really be there for him and to support him. And so they basically confessed that sin. They said that the holiness of God has been offended in this place, that we want to repent, and had an incredible sense of outpouring of the Spirit, which laid the groundwork for a new pastor coming in. So the trust in the elders went way up at that point in time, and the gossip was gone. So when I came 9 months later, I think the people that had weathered the storm were really motivated to move forward.
Well, and I'm also wondering if because of what happened, you have a much closer relationship with your elder board than you might otherwise have.
Well, there's no question about that. Our elders meet every Friday morning at 6 a.m. we spend 1 hour in prayer and looking at the Word. So we basically look at the message I'm going to be preaching that Sunday, and I talk through it. They give me feedback. And then we spend the second hour talking about the direction of the church. That tradition has continued for 23 years, and the chairman of the elder board is my accountability partner. We meet weekly to talk about our personal lives. So that idea that the elders are now responsible to make sure that they stay close to their pastor has been consistent since that time.
Yeah, you can imagine that in churches that haven't had the same walk that yours has had, that perhaps the lay leadership would be more inclined to be complacent about their role. But when something like this happens, it really shows the importance that the church isn't just the pastor. It belongs to leadership that's there already.
I completely agree with that. And I think that one of the characteristics typically of a megachurch is they're real personality focused. Yeah. The gifting of the senior pastor tends to drive quite hard in that. And our church is really not characterized that way. Mm-hmm. Our lay leadership team believes that they're called by God to give oversight and direction to the church, and they feel very empowered to do that. And if you ask our congregation, what are the 1, 2, 3 characteristics that you feel like are the strongest in the church? The first one that we consistently get is that the Bible is clearly being taught, that we live by the Bible. The second one is that we trust the leadership. So out of the tragedy of that experience, God just blossomed a real strength in our congregation, and that's we've got lay people that lead spiritually in our church.
Boy, what a great resurrection story!
It really is.
And so I want to get before I leave you on that topic, because again, I think a lot of our churches have either gone through that or will. Is that you had to come into a situation, sure, 70 people had left, you had 180 people there, but the level of distrust, if it wasn't out there, it was certainly the subtext of conversations that, okay, we've stayed here, we can trust the elders, but here's another guy that they're bringing in who's seems like a nice guy, seems just like the last guy. How did you go about allaying those worries and building trust?
Well, let me complicate it even a little bit more. The pastor that left was 46, and had teenagers and been married for a long time and so forth. So I was coming in really just fresh out of seminary and then a church plant. So I was 29. We had been married less than 5 years. We had just had our first child, was a little over a year old, and so I was coming in as kind of the kid. And I don't know whether that may have actually helped, because I think that the sense that the elders were kind of dad to me, that they were going to watch out for me and take care of me, I think that I actually borrowed some of their credibility because I was younger and less experienced. Okay. But we also just set in place a lot of just protocol that I think also helped. So the way we structured our offices, the way we had staff relationships, counseling, how we did counseling, we just put a layer in place of just ways to go about interpersonal relationships that to the outside may have seemed a little bit legalistic at the time, but for the congregation, that's what they really just kind of needed to know, that we were paying attention to the details to prevent things like that from happening. And then I just think that the Spirit really overwhelmed us with outpouring of blessing. We saw God answer some really incredible prayers, some kind of amazing healings took place. And as we preached the gospel, people were growing. And I think a lot of the life change in people also created some credibility that the ministry was of the Spirit. It wasn't just of the flesh. So.
Well, I appreciate you spending some time on that, Tim, because I do think a lot of people have walked in your shoes, etc. And so let's take us forward, because now you're certainly a lot larger than 180 people. Tell us about the operation there.
Well, it's a pretty major operation. We've got 80 people on staff. Wow. And so we've got really, I think, about between 35 and $40 million worth of facilities here, all paid for through our capital campaigns and everything, completely paid for. And about 5,000, between 5,000 and 5,500 people worship on Sunday morning. So we're talking about a huge number of people. Easter Sunday, we had 11,000 people here. So lots and lots of people. And in the process of all that, our goal is an Ephesians 4 ministry where the leaders equip the saints to do the work of service. So more than 50% of the people that attend here are actively involved in some identifiable ministry that is more than periodic. In other words, it's at least once a month that they're engaged in some kind of serving in an identifiable way. And we're also always working on seeing that number go up, because the power of the church is in the ordinary individual empowered by the supernatural work of the Spirit.
Yeah, and you know by working at it, because when you began, of course, I'm sure did not have the same management skills that you need now. You didn't have the same. I mean, you're involved in all facets when you're a one-man show, and now your skill set has had to totally evolve, hasn't it?
It really has. There was a time when I felt like I did everything, and now
you probably did.
I did. I really did. And I remember going through various stages where I'm not going to do counseling anymore. I just can't do that. I'm not going to do hospital visitation anymore. I can't do that. I can't go to every party. I can't do every wedding. I remember that the moment, and we were at about 500 in attendance, when standing at the door greeting people as they left, I realized I was seeing faces of people that I'd seen multiple times and I didn't know their name, and realized that was it was not going to be something that I could possibly keep up with everybody. So really beginning to learn how to meaningfully delegate, turn the ministry over to other people, that was a huge challenge. And frankly, I probably have as many failures every day as I have successes in that.
Well, at least you're honest about it. I want to touch on that a bit, because I've spoken with some guests on this show, Tim, who've said that one of the most common, I don't want to say problems, but the most common deficits in church ministry is that pastors have a really hard time delegating. They have a hard time letting go of things and a hard time hiring. And I wonder if you could walk us through the things that you've seen, the skills that you've been able to hone in these areas.
Well, delegating is a really big challenge, and being able to understand the challenge between excellence and quality, and allowing other people to have ownership and involvement is a big struggle. And here's kind of where we landed philosophically. We would rather have a B- idea that people can unite behind and lead than an A+ idea that simply resides in the minds of the staff but will never be implemented because we don't have the bandwidth to implement it. So I would rather be doing a lot of things in an average way that allows our lay people to have ownership and access to it with minimal involvement from our staff than to have the neatest, best, the coolest ideas that just never get implemented.
You brought up this term I'd not heard it before, Tim. Maybe you can help me understand it. Excellence versus quality. What do you mean by that?
Well, excellence, it tends, to me, as I define excellence, it tends to focus on making sure everything's done right. And when I talk about the concept of quality, I'm tending to focus more on, is it having an impact in the lives of individuals? And I think that sometimes our models, particularly in megachurches, is to kind of chase Hollywood or kind of chase the latest technological fad. In other words, we work on what we could possibly pull off and spend a lot of time trying to live up to a level or standard of what is possible to do, and yet at the same time fail to recognize that most people don't really live in that world. They live in a world that has meaning and value to them personally. And so if we can focus on what has meaning and value to the people and embrace ministries that move us in those directions, giving access to lay people to use their gifts, we're gonna be way far ahead down the long run.
Okay. So excellence has to do again with making sure everything is done right versus quality. And is that an either or what do you mean?
It's a fine dance. You're constantly doing that because achiever people, and we tend to gather achiever people on our staff, they're constantly looking at how can we make things better.
Yeah.
And I'm constantly fighting with them to say, let's not always worry about making things better. Let's worry about whether we're actually making things meaningful to the people we're working with.
Okay. So what do you look for when you've got to hire somebody? That used to be an easier question when you had one or two to hire, but you've got 80-person staff now. What are some of the basics?
Well, walk with Jesus Christ is the number one thing. And there are lots and lots of people in ministry that this seemed like a great career path for them. And they love Jesus, but that's not the focus of their life. And so trying to kind of work through that to make sure that people are passionate about Jesus Christ is probably the number one thing. In our context, having someone that works well with ambiguity is also very important.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the complexity of taking our values and then moving them into all of the different types of personalities and wiring of our lay folks to get them really up to speed and involved requires a lot of compromise, a lot of give and take, a lot of stating our values, but letting people shape what that's going to look like in ministry. And so a person that's real rigid, that needs to kind of get a system in place and run their system, will not function as well in our environment as they may, say, in an environment that's more structured, more controlled, sometimes smaller. So we're looking for people that actually, what I tell our hiring team, because we've got a hiring team that works with us in this process, I tell our hiring team, as you guys look at people, I'm looking for leaders who lead through influence rather than leaders who lead through structure. And it's not a quality issue. One is not better than the other. They're just different skill sets. And lots of people create systems to lead through. We're looking for people who lead through influence. In other words, they can release lots of people to create, ideate, plan, organize, orchestrate. So we're never really buttoned down around here. We're always on the move.
Okay. And has this growth, I mean, does it continue? Do you feel like you're at kind of a plateau, or does each Easter keep getting bigger?
Well, it typically keeps getting bigger. We're growing on average of about 7 to 10% per year.
Okay.
But we're also planting churches. We've planted 22 churches over the life of our church. And so we're constantly sending people out. We'll plant anywhere between 2 and 3 churches a year. We have been over the last 5 years. And some of our daughter churches and our granddaughter churches are also now beginning to plant. So we're constantly sending people away.
And where are you sending them to? Is it in the local neighborhood? Is it throughout Texas? Where do you send people? Which denomination? Are you a denomination at all?
No, we're not a denomination.
Okay.
It's primarily in the greater Austin area.
Okay.
Almost all of our churches are focused on greater Austin. So we have a church plant training residency that we recruit planters in.
Wow. Okay.
And we're working to plant them here. Our vision really focuses on trying to reach Austin with the gospel. So our emphasis is very city-oriented.
Okay. And so 22 churches in the Austin area that you all have planted since then. How do you go about identifying where and how to plant? I mean, I think of Texas, and I think of, boy, a state that doesn't need any more churches. You all have a lot of them. But I mean, talk to me.
Well, Austin is the exception.
Okay.
When you think about Texas, it's the buckle on the Bible Belt, so to speak.
Yeah.
Austin's very different. Austin is a very unchurched city. Its demographics are much more East Coast, West Coast type feel. University of Texas is here. State legislature's here. State government, and those cities tend to have a more non-churched kind of feel to the city.
Yeah.
So we're really we're very underchurched, and in addition to that, the city is growing so quickly that the current churches could not keep up with just the population growth. So that's kind of our focus, and we have a whole criteria that we use to determine the receptivity of an area, and a lot of demographics that we use going into that. But we try to identify the areas that we feel like are the most receptive to a new church, and then we try to match the kind of the flavor of the people who live in that area to the personality of the church planter, so that we put together a good marriage. So we're not going to put somebody in a Spanish-speaking context that doesn't have a Spanish-speaking background, or we're not going to put an older guy into a real young demographic.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, so you've got all of these. I can imagine if you planted 22, you've got it kind of down to a science. Do you ever partner with existing congregations, or are all these brand new?
We try as best we can to partner with existing congregations. We've run into a little challenge in Austin because most of the existing congregations kind of have their own mentality of what they're trying to do. So kind of breaking through the denominational issues and building trust has really been the focus the last 2 years. I don't feel like we've worked at it long enough to be able to have confidence whether we can or cannot. But we've put a lot of time into relational equity. I personally put a lot of time into relational equity in the last couple of years, just trying to say, we're not the only church in town. We want everybody to succeed. It's not about size, not about denomination. It's about the gospel. So
well, yeah, and when you look at the numbers, I mean, I don't know what it's like, but I think nationally, I don't know what it's like in Austin, but something like 21% of the population in America goes to church on Sunday. So you've got 79% that is not, for whatever reason. Maybe they're Buddhist, maybe they're whatever, but probably a great number of them are looking for, or your congregation would do a world of good in their lives were they to find it.
Exactly. We actually brought in Ed Stetzer to do a survey of the spiritual climate of our city. And of the 1.7 million people that make up the 7 counties of Central Texas, 600,000 of them said that they believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God who died on the cross and rose from the dead, and that you can go to heaven by believing in him, which means 1.1 million said they did not believe that. Now, how much of that is kind of a halo effect of people reaching way back to their first confirmation or their Sunday school days, but don't actually live that out of the 600,000, and how many of them really truly would embrace that as their life message? I don't know. But 1.1 million people, that's a big mission field.
Yeah, that's a huge mission field. And I want to get back to something you said earlier because it really piqued my interest. You don't seem to be real comfortable unless things are changing, Tim.
That's correct.
And so you create an environment. I'm looking for your exact quote here, that you are looking, because of the growth that you've had, that becoming creative and looking towards the new seems to be almost a core value. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. Because a lot of churches and a lot of people aren't always comfortable with change, and you seem to say that's got to be the saddle we're sitting on.
Right. What I tell our team is I would like to have about 70% of our ministries operating within the kind of system that would allow a layperson to plug in, do ministry, and not have to learn anything new for 3, 4, 5 years. But about every 5 years, at the longest, we would reevaluate that ministry to see what needs to change. And then about 30% of our ministries need to be entrepreneurial, kind of thinking about what are the new opportunities to reach people the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so we innovate with about 30% of what's taking place, which feels, from a leadership standpoint, like a lot. From our lay people standpoint, I don't want our small group leaders to feel like every year we're changing our small group ministry. I want them to be able to plug in as a small group leader and really get comfortable shepherding a group of people and not seeing a lot of change. So it's kind of that fine line between having the kind of dynamic changes that would be allowing more people to get involved, the gospel to touch more people, and for us to be looking at the creative entrepreneurial edge, and yet creating enough stability that the average person who goes to work at Dell could lead a small group for 4 or 5 years and feel real comfortable that they're doing what God's called them to do.
I want to ask you a question that, the big reveal survey that Bill Hybels' church came out with years ago came out saying that, they were very good at introducing people to Christ and giving, and, with very low barriers, being able to incorporate seeker type people, if I can use that term. However, it got very difficult when they began trying to get people towards the higher part of the ladder of deep Christian maturity. And that can really be hard, not only in evangelical circles, but also when you have as many people coming through the doors as you do. And I want you to comment on that, because I'm sure you've experienced that. And for Bill Hybels, it continues to be a source of troublesome source. But I'm curious as to how you are addressing that.
It's a great question. We did the Reveal survey. We kind of found the same thing in our congregation. And one of the big challenges that I think we all wrestle with is, on the one hand, we want the church to be all things to all people, and every church should be able to do it all. And reality is that's not going to happen. And so a lot of megachurches really focus on evangelism and early discipleship and create and build systems that focus on those things. But once the people reach a certain level of maturity, they're looking for a different expression within the body of Christ to help them take those next steps. That really bothers megachurch pastors, because then they tend to think, well, I just got this person equipped and prepared to lead, and then they move on. Part of the way we're wrestling with that and addressing that is, one, to be satisfied that people are going to leave us. And that's okay, particularly if they're leaving us to go with one of our church plants, because there's a huge leadership opportunity. Men that would never probably sit on the elder board here at the mother church are becoming elders in these other new church plants, and it's just a lot more access for them to take leadership. Men that lead worship, women that lead worship are getting to go to a church plant and step right on the platform and lead, where they don't have that same opportunity here. So that's one of our outlets. The other outlet is we're trying to pioneer a model of ministry that allows a lay team and a staff member to work in partnership, where the lay team truly guides the ministry. And we talk about the whole idea of peer leaders. And a peer leader is someone who has input to the outcome, so that we can take a man or a woman who works at IBM and leads a division to come to our church and give leadership to major movements of our church, not sitting under a staff member, simply kind of that middle management role, tell me what to do and I'll go try to do it, but actually giving direction to our staff, direction to our church. And so we also find that gives us an opportunity to disciple those people at a higher level, and they feel more of an ownership than, we've got the 3 things that we do. Plug into one of those 3. After you've done it for 5 years, just do it some more, which is typically what we as megachurches do.
Okay.
So,
I can imagine, Tim, with the way that God has blessed your congregation through you, that you've been asked to go out and travel a bit, talk a little bit about what's been going on there. And as you look at the landscape of churches in North America, I'm wondering what you see as our biggest challenges these days. As you know, 4 out of 5 churches are not growing. Yours is not in that category, but most others are.
Yeah. Great question, and I think the issues are manifold. I think there's a lot of them. I would say the primary thing that I feel like is going on in the church is churches have institutionalized around a culture that is not very accessible to the average young person in America. That the culture has moved dramatically in a different mode and different direction, and the average church is still functioning the way they did and thinking the way they did 20 years ago. And the challenge there is oftentimes those things that happened 20 years ago are now institutionalized, sometimes theologized, to be right, righteous, the right way to do things. And so the divide between the culture, the people we're going after, and the people that are part of the church seems to be getting bigger. Mm-hmm. What that does is that, to me, I think that creates a bifurcation in the life of the average believer. They kind of go to church for the holy part of their life, and then they go into their world for the normal part of their life, mm-hmm. and live comfortably with that division taking place. And I think oftentimes churches don't recognize that's actually happening.
Yeah, well, and so how does that, so because of this gap that you see, is that what you think is keeping more people away from church that normally would be if the church were better able to keep up with the context in which it's doing ministry?
Yeah, I really think that for us, the key is we need our people having spiritually redemptive conversations with the people in the community. When our people are having spiritually redemptive conversations with the people in the community, they really come back to the organized church and propose the changes, rather than the leadership kind of coming up with this idea that we need to become more relevant. We got people that are coming back and actually leading and encouraging that change, because they're having spiritually redemptive conversations with people that are scratching their head going, I don't get what you guys do. I don't get why you do that. And so to me, the number one thing that I think pastors personally can do is get outside of the day-to-day activity of their church and go talk to people, interact with people, have spiritually redemptive conversations, be willing to listen to what people are saying, and then lead your people into those kinds of relationships. So we're encouraging our people to start having dinner with their neighbors. Just invite your neighbors over to your house and serve them a meal and have a conversation. And to us, it's been just amazing. The more we get our people doing that, the more relevant we become. Not through any kind of program, just because people have a lot of unchurched friends.
Yeah. Well, explain how you've been able to implement that in your life and in your ministry.
Well, personally, my wife and I, we actually just relocated to a new neighborhood, mm-hmm. because we'd kind of farmed our neighborhood. You kind of run into a place where you've after 23 years living in the same neighborhood, the neighbors that stiff arm you and the neighbors who welcome you in. And so we just moved to a new neighborhood, and our goal is to have every single person in our neighborhood over to our house. So we've started having people over for dinner. So we had our Hindu neighbors over. We actually had our Jewish neighbors over and served them pork, if you can imagine that.
Did they eat it?
They're Reformed Jews, and so they don't practice the dietary laws, and we ask in advance. But mm-hmm. So we've started to do that personally, and I share that with our congregation. So I'll tell them, here's what we're doing to get to know our neighbors, hosting block parties and so forth. And then when I prepare to preach, I want to preach through the lens of the people that I'm trying to reach out to, because I want to train our congregation in my preaching as they listen to me, mm-hmm. how they can both learn and talk to the people they're connecting with. One of the guys in the U.S. that I think does it really well is Tim Keller in New York. Mm. And as you listen to a guy that's very theological in his preaching, you notice that if you just take what he says, you can go have a conversation with a man on the street, because he's framing up the discussion in terms and in illustrations that normal people in the culture can relate to. So,
okay, so you see this as really, I mean, you really were emphatic about the importance of getting out, meeting people in the neighborhood. As you talk with and frame the program your church planters go through, what are some of the other attributes that you look for in Christian leadership at Hill Country?
Well, we are looking for people that are very relational in nature. And we believe that the gospel is very relational. And in a postmodern culture where people don't trust your truth until they trust you, that you're genuine, you care, and so forth, we really believe that the transformation of people being willing to listen to the gospel and evaluate the merits of the gospel has a lot to do with relationships. And so we train and coach our church planters. We, first of all, look for people that have a relational focus, but then we train and coach around that so that we can even help people that are introverted in nature learn how to use even their own kind of quiet, reflective approach to life to engage other people that have that same quiet, reflective approach. But we're very intentional about relationships.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so a relational people getting outside. What other you talked a little bit about entrepreneurialism and ability to start things.
Right.
How important is that in your church leaders?
That's a big deal in our church planters. It's not as big of a deal in our staff members or our lay leaders, because if a staff member or lay leader can find people that do have that entrepreneurial nature and then just fan their flame, just fan their enthusiasm, that's a win for us. The church planters need a level of self-starting because we're putting them out with a small group of people into an area, and our prayer is that the church would actually emerge from the lostness of the culture. So as they go out and spend a year developing relationships before they ever launch a public service, the goal would be that people would be coming to faith and joining the church as it emerges, which cuts down on the territorialism, because we're not trying to steal people out of other churches in the area. We're not going after those people at all. We're going after the people from the culture. So if you don't self-start, you're not going to survive in that kind of church planning model.
What draws people to Hill Country? Why would I want to go to your church?
I think a number of things. If you're looking to understand what the Bible says and how it applies to life, we're real good at that. That's our bread and butter. So we don't teach at a theological level that you would expect to get at a Bible college or seminary, but we also don't teach at such a practical level that you could pick up, in a self-help book at the Christian bookstore. It's Bible teaching that still has the history, the doctrine, the backgrounds, but it has a strong application to everybody's day-to-day life. So I think people are attracted to that. Okay. I think people are also attracted to a community church that's very involved in the community. So 70% of the people who visit, they were invited by a friend. 30% of the people who visit heard of our relationship within the community. So we support the police, we support the firemen, we're involved in civic activities, we're helping the poor. We're doing a lot of things like that just creates an environment in the community where people feel real positive toward our church. And I'd say the final thing is we are in the suburbs, so we have a lot of families who live in our area, and our children's ministry is just absolutely fantastic. It's got a strong teaching component, but it's fun. And most visitors will tell us that after they visit, their kids keep asking them to bring them back to our children's ministry.
And how do you, I imagine, and you were there when the children's ministry really had just your kid in it.
Right, exactly.
How have you seen it grow, and what are some of the things you've done in order to help it grow?
Well, my wife has a degree from seminary in Christian education, so she played a big role in the early days, laying a foundation. But we have worked really hard to get a lot of volunteers, a lot of parents and volunteers involved, so that we are not Spartan in our children's ministry. We don't have 27 kids in a classroom with one teacher pulling his hair out, trying to manage the chaos. We have a well-oiled machine that has teachers, assistants, helpers, and we recruit heavily. We also recruit a lot of men and women. So there's a strong balance. A lot of times boys will go to Sunday school for years and they'll never have a male presence in their Sunday school. We do a real strong, kind of both and in the genders. So we see a lot of kids, particularly the boys, have somebody to climb on and wrestle with, and that sets a really good tone for boys. And then we've just been creative over the years. We've got various creative people that do music and worship and drama and so forth that help in addition to our traditional Sunday school.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I can imagine you've had some great, well, I know you've had some great successes. We just look at the numbers and look at certainly what's happened. But what are some of the not so successful things you've done that you've really learned some important lessons from? If you could just name one.
Yeah, there's all kinds of things.
Yeah, that well is deep, huh?
Yeah, it's really deep. And along the way, I would say trying to figure out how to balance staff and lay involvement has been a struggle, and where we've landed today has really been the result of some failures. At one point in time, we thought that the best thing we could do to facilitate lay ministry was to give every lay-led ministry a staff member to relate to, so that staff member could promote them, encourage them, get their stuff communicated. Mm-hmm. What we found out after a year and a half or 2 years is that most of the staff members brought those ministries under their area and then killed them. Because now that they had 24 ministries to manage that they couldn't keep up with,
right,
they just basically, I mean, it wasn't mean-spirited. They just, by neglect, and the lay people felt like, well, now I've got a staff member that's supposed to be running this ministry, so I guess I just need to let them run it. And so we lost a lot of people and traction in areas where the Spirit had been moving people by trying to overly organize. So you heard earlier in my comments, we've kind of gone the other way now.
Yeah.
Pendulum swings the other way. So I would say that's been a huge struggle.
Okay. And then, one thing I'm really curious about, Tim, because I think this is so important in leadership, is the spiritual makeup and devotion of the leader. And certainly as you've seen your congregation grow, you've seen everything around you evolve and grow. I can imagine the challenges to keeping rooted has been a challenge as well. And I wonder if you could share with us how you go about keeping the axe sharpened.
That's really good. I would say probably the single greatest thing that I've implemented that has helped me is one day a month, I take a day, call it a day of prayer and planning, and just get away by myself with my Bible and my calendar. And just sit down, and primarily my calendar's there to ensure that I am calendaring out my personal time. So the daily time I'm going to spend with God, I want to make sure that's on my calendar. And if anything like travel or meetings or whatever would interrupt that time, that I've planned for that to make sure that I've gotten it worked into my schedule. Same thing with exercise, with family time. So I'm taking the priorities that really give life to me and to the ministry here, and taking those things and made sure that I put those things in on a regular basis, and that I don't violate those. So, excuse me, the times when I feel like I've drifted spiritually, I can look back and see that I've missed those days of prayer and planning, which kind of sets the tone for the rest of the month. Because if it's on my calendar, I will do it. If it's not on my calendar with all the things that are being pushed in,
right,
that's when I find myself drifting. So the second thing that's also been helpful is that we rotate the chairman of our board, and so each year we will have a different chairman, and I meet with the chairman as an accountability partner. We meet every week just to talk about our souls, talk about our families, to pray about things. That's also been very helpful to me, very helpful. The third thing is to just have a group of pastors that I spend time with. Once a month, I've got a group of 10 pastors from the area. We spend 3 hours together with the only agenda asking and answering the question, what's the condition of your soul? And we've been together for a long time now, and that's also been very helpful to me. So those are the external things that I do to try to bring clarity to my relationship with God. And then within my time with God and interacting with Him, that's where I find his guidance and leadership.
And I'm wondering how I mean, you just kind of set that as a priority. I can imagine there are a lot of things trying to creep in on your schedule.
It has to be a priority. The times when I've drifted and when I know that I'm ministering out of the flesh, that it's not right with my soul. And over the past 23 years here, I can tell you there have been numerous times when the Holy Spirit just grabbed a hold of me and said, where you're going right now, you're going without me, because I'm not. I mean, look at your life, look at your head, look at your heart. It's not with me. So, honestly, as much through failure as through consistency, God's taught me over and over again, if I don't put these things into my life and maintain them in my life, my soul will not be right with God.
I want to get back to what you talked about in that third, the third thing you mentioned when we talked a little bit about how you keep the spiritual life sharpened, and that is that you meet regularly, and you have met regularly with a group of local pastors. A lot of our clergy in this country, I think most of them leave the ministry without retiring. I mean, there's a lot of burnout, and it's not an easy job. How did you go about finding these folk, and how highly, how do you go about maintaining that group?
It's a great question. In the city of Austin, a number of years ago, a pastor had a vision called Pastors in Covenant. He actually got it from a friend of his in Phoenix who was doing it in Phoenix. And the idea behind a Pastors in Covenant is you would get a group of pastors that would meet together with no agenda but their soul. And they would covenant with each other that at least 10 out of 12 months they would be present to support the other pastors. And so they asked me if I would be willing to join a group. A number of years ago, I joined that group, and more than half of the guys that joined that group are still part of it. There have been a few people that have moved and come and gone, but truly, these guys have become my brothers. We depend on each other. I'll get emails or questions from guys who will say, I'm going through a tough time. Could you pray for me? And that takes place outside the meeting. A teenage suicide happened in one of the guys' churches just the week of Easter, and he's asking the group, hey, how would you guys handle this? What would you say in this situation? We're sending him outlines of funerals that we've done in those situations. So consulting and conversations from how do you raise money to my wife is really struggling with somebody in the ministry. What do I need to do there? To I'm tempted in a relationship. Would you guys pray for me, hold me accountable? I mean, you cover the spectrum, and we've had those conversations. And the commitment that we're going to meet at least 10 times out of the 12, and that we're there for each other has just been incredible. So we actually have a council of pastors in Austin now that start new groups. And when new pastors come to town, they call them up and say, we'd love to get you plugged into one of these groups.
Okay.
So I think we've got 120 pastors currently that are in one of those groups.
And that can be tough, too, because, I mean, clergy especially, you get 10 of them in a room, Tim, and, it's always about outdoing the other, or about how many you got at your church, or whatever kind of, contest you want to call it. But that's got to be tough to break down, especially when you just meet once a month.
Well, the monitor of the group is responsible to make sure that nobody's promoting an event. You can't use the group to promote an event, that you're really talking about your soul. And there may be ministry-related things about your soul that you're talking about, but you're really talking about your soul, and that we pray for one another. And new guys come into a group that's existing, and they will pick up the DNA of that pretty quickly. When the group first forms, usually it takes 3 or 4 months for somebody to break the ice of vulnerability. But eventually one of the pastors will say, hey guys, I just want to be real about something I'm dealing with. And our experience has been once that happens, everything changes. Now the guys that are so driven that kind of time does not appeal to them, they tend to self-select out after a while.
Okay.
But cross denominations, cross sizes of churches, we see a brotherhood that's formed over the years.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, listen, Tim, as we wind up our time together, I always like to ask at the end of the interview, is there anything you came to the interview that you'd like to talk about that I haven't brought up? Is there anything during the interview that piqued your interest that I didn't let you finish talking about, that you'd like to share more about. You've got an audience of Christians, Christian leaders who are interested in, at least they've listened this far, in what God's doing with you. Well,
let me share a couple books with you that I think have been really helpful to me, and that may be something that your listeners would be interested in.
Sure, sure.
The first book is by Warren Bennis, Why Leaders Can't Lead. I don't know if you've read this one or not. It's an old book. This book is a secular book dealing with how do you avoid the institutionalism of whatever venture you're in, because institutionalism is what tends to keep us from doing what we're supposed to be doing. So that book's really helpful to me. Second book that I went through this with my sons. It's called Integrity by Henry Cloud. This book is so good. I've had all of our staff go through it. Henry Cloud basically says that integrity is having the courage to meet the demands of reality. And most of us think integrity simply means preventing bad things from happening, like don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat. But he does such a great job of pointing out, and I use this with our staff, I use it with my sons, that if you are willing to step into a role, then you, by nature of stepping in that role, have owned the responsibilities of that role. And integrity is to do that role well. And it's amazing how many staff people we have conversations with that are looking, they stepped into the role to get a job and to do their ministry. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're willing to meet the demands of that role.
Sure.
Final book, theology book for fun. Cornelius Plantinga, Not the Way It's Supposed to Be. This is a book on sin and the effects of sin. And one of the things I think's really helped me in my vision casting and ministry is to try to understand both sides of what God's doing in the world. The brokenness of the world on the one hand, and to be able to communicate that effectively to people, this is not the way it's supposed to be. That's an incredibly positive thing, because a lot of people in the world think that actually the things that are self-destructive are the best things in life. So helping them think through that's really positive. And then the other side of the redemptive equation is the beauty of the kingdom and what God's preparing and planning for us. So that's given me a lot of freshness over the past 10 years, having been in ministry for a long time now. So those big ideas kind of motivate my heart. And so those are things that I just think personally help me a lot.
Tim Hawks, Hill Country Church in the Austin, Texas area. Thanks for joining me on Church Next.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Chris, for having me.